The talk aims at presenting the observation of blended learning techniques in interpreter training. These techniques are seen as a possibility to complement the usual class training methodology by showing the learners one or more methods for improving their personal interpreting skills and thus helping them learn how to learn. My experience shows that online resources may be extremely effective for the purposes of blended learning, while students find them helpful when they are preparing to work at communicative events. Today, the demands of market and pressures at the university requires modification of the existing programs by giving students greater control over their learning, and interpreting studies are not an exception. I'm going to show you how an introduction of blended learning in interpreting studies and designing proper individual and group work has helped and improved to carry out the program in a very limited time frame. According to Kay Thorne, blended learning is the most logical and natural evolution of our learning agenda. It suggests an elegant solution to the challenges of tailoring learning and development to the needs of the individuals. It represents an opportunity to innovate and technological advances with interaction and participation offered in the best traditional learning. It can be supported and enhanced by using the wisdom and one-to-one contact of personal coaches. So blended learning is actually a mix of multimedia technologies, CD-ROM, streaming, virtual classrooms, voicemail, email, and conference call, online text animation, and video streaming. But how is blended learning a valuable tool to be taken into consideration in interpretation studies curriculum design? And how does it help learner autonomy? The scientific approach to curriculum, especially in interpretation studies, provides a framework for instructional design by viewing the acquisition of interpretation competence as a process. This means that it stresses down the breakdown of composite skills into competent skills and their subsequent reintegration, as well as sequencing of learning events according to the difficulty and increasing complexity of tasks. We actually break down the competencies in various skills and tasks. So, an appropriate sequence of instruction can be identified for an educational program through the description of skill levels and developmental milestones grounded in the principles of expertise. This actually means that we have to deal with language skills, transfer skills, domain knowledge, knowledge of the profession, and professional identity. In the learning process, especially in interpretation, we have to deal actually with lifelong learning as an integral part of the interpreters, and learner autonomy is enhanced or should be enhanced. Concerning learner autonomy, according to the European Framework for the Languages, once teaching stops, further learning has to be autonomous. Autonomous learning can be promoted if learning to learn is regarded as an integral part of language learning, so learners become increasingly aware of the way they learn, the options open to them, and the options brought increasingly to make choices in respect of objectives, materials, and working methods in the light of their own needs, motivations, characteristics, and resources that better suit them. So, if we examine the curriculum of the European Masters of Conference Interpreting or other programs, they depict actually the actual job description of an interpreter. And they set out a lot of modules. There is actually theory of interpretation, practice, consecutive, simultaneous. We all know the programs, and a wide range of optional courses as linguistic, communication skills, conference preparation, note-taking. The practice of interpretation also includes voice coaching, public speaking, conference preparation, professional ethics. So we have various training skills. We all know that, and we also know that during the final assessment, what has to be carried out during the consecutive interpretation and the simultaneous. And how this corresponds to the job description. When in the programs they are talking about assessment, they are talking about the final assessment. But what is important in interpretation is actually the formative assessment, that is, what the student has accomplished and what furthermore has to be done in order to achieve and to be competent during the final assessment. The program that I'm teaching is usually a an undergraduate program. But, however, there is a large number of students that are postgraduate students or students that have even accomplished an MA or even sometimes a PhD, and they are going on for further training. So the groups are far from homogeneous, since there are MA students along with students that are in the first undergraduate degree. So there is a great number of challenges ahead of us. Students, depending on the background, they don't have an equal depth of knowledge in all subjects, and therefore additional documentation and documentation strategies are needed. Even if they have an excellent command of their mother tongue and a wide range of topics and registers, at least during the formative assessment, we see that their performance is dependent on the subject sometimes. Thus, the selection of speech websites provides students with resources for their practices and is a valuable tool. Students have more or less the same educational background sometimes, but they tackle speeches in a different way. In such a case, online training material or the selection of training material has to be personalized, at least in the beginning, in order to overcome individual training needs. An in-depth knowledge of the working language is necessary, but even in the same group, we have sometimes native speakers and C2 speakers. In such a case, for instance, in the case of French into Greek, we used TV5 videos that were actually prepared in the internet in order to help. They were actual TV videos, but they were also adapted in order to help French language learners, but they covered issues from Canada, Africa, France, Switzerland, and the online material included also transcription. This online material was used initially and was extremely helpful for the overall knowledge of international affairs and language, and mainly for student practice. It was the fact that even the transcription was available was very helpful because it helps students develop their autonomy and even be able to carry out their self-assessment at the end of their tasks. Initially, we saw that there was a preference for speech websites and a clear preference for collaborative multimedia multilingual websites. In the beginning, the selection was done by the trainer as a tool, but then the students were asked to choose themselves the material that they were going to work on in order to see how they managed to cope with that and what they hoped to accomplish. The pre-selection was actually made according to the difficulties students faced with implicit information. Literature on preparation and background knowledge indicates that professional trainers, professional interpreters do not dedicate a lot of time in background knowledge in the language combination they work their working days due to the heavy workload. The novice interpreters during their studies, they were also asked at different stages of their training to interpret political speeches by French politicians, and we recorded the way they managed to tackle implicit information in the beginning and when additional training was assigned in order to handle this type of texts. Students are also called to have good powers of concentration, analysis, and synthesis. If we examine the performance, there are indications that even if the same error appeared in the target language, the causes were different, and successful candidates were the ones that the best coordinated their efforts according to the zeal effort model, and fatigue appeared to interfere with the overall outcome, sometimes during the beginning, at least. When integrated blended learning, performance was improved steadily, and training was facilitated through online training material that was addressed to all candidates, and additional material was assigned for specific needs. Field data shows that the individual training needs are addressed, students develop their potential and their competencies. Thus, blended learning clearly improves the overall performance of students, addressing individual needs. But there is a problem there because we cannot have a control group in order to compare the differences and the variations in performance. Students' performance data suggests that technology enhanced has been proved helpful for sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, note-taking, intonation, and pragmatic competence. In a 2-year interpreting course, learners' motivation, confidence, linguistic competence, and skills were enhanced. So, face-to-face training was concentrating on both techniques, information density, and implicitly. In interpreter training, whether linear or modified linear, or Y-modified track or parallel track, there is always the problem of heterogeneous groups with different target groups and a wide range of student profiles. Thus, blended learning proves very helpful in the initial stages, and it reinforces the competencies in consecutive, simultaneous, and simultaneous with text. Instead of an enormous workload, there is refinement of the competencies, and according to the needs, blended learning is used on domain, cultural, or research competence. The goal is to perform the work as supervised and to perform in a variety of situations in different rates of speech of the original. Through this process, students manage to respond to demanding tasks according to the distribution of new information, concrete and abstract types of information, highly specialized text, different genres, and rhetorical organization. The overall aim was to allow students to examine their learning process and actually to evaluate their learning process and take responsibility of their learning, to see gaps in their learning, to support their own learning, preparing for the future career. Thank you.